Today we're going to talk about Buddhism. Many people think Buddhism is a mellow, relaxed religion that isn't really a religion, but there are extremists in every group. So let's get into it. Buddhism is the fourth largest religion in the world, with around 520 million members, which is about 7% of the world's population. They have some holy writings too, just like Christians have the Bible or Muslims have the Quran. The core Buddhist holy writings, and please forgive me because I'm 100% sure I'm gonna f this up, so I'm only pronouncing each one once, but they're called Pali Tipitaka, Theravada texts, Mahayana Sutras, and the Salistamba Sutra. The first one translates to 3 baskets, and it's made up of 3 smaller texts. They're the oldest writings of Buddhism, which itself is pretty old. Not as old as you'd think though, it's about 2,500 years old, so it was started around the year 500 BCE. For the Christians out there, that's about 500 years before Jesus died. So it's actually older than Christianity. Anyways, like I was saying, the first book is made up of 3 smaller books, and they're the oldest writings they have. The second book includes stuff from the 5th century. The third set of writings are writings that some Buddhists claim are original teachings of Buddha. Scholars pretty much agree that the earliest writings in it couldn't have been from Buddha because they're from the 1st century. We'll get to why that's important in a second. And then we have the final set of writings, which were preserved in Tibetan Buddhist monasteries. Most of this stuff was originally written in Sanskrit, but a lot of the original Sanskrit is lost in time. So about Buddha. I mentioned earlier that some tribes, I guess you'd call them, of Buddhists claimed that the writings were straight from Buddha himself. So who the f*** is this Buddha guy? It was a man named Siddhartha, which means he who achieves his aim. So I'm totally sure that was a real guy and that's his real name. Anyways, he supposedly lived between 600 and 400 BCE in Nepal. Most scholars agree that he was a real guy, but the things he did aren't really established. Much like Jesus. A pretty good portion of the scholarly community thinks Jesus was probably a real dude, but that's basically all they know about him. They haven't been able to establish almost anything else. So the story goes, Siddhartha, also known as Gautama Buddha, experimented with different teachings for years and couldn't get on board with any of them. Finally, he spent one night in deep meditation, at which point all of the answers he was searching for came to him. He achieved full awareness and became Buddha. Supposedly, he sat under a tree that night and vowed not to stand until he had the answers he was looking for. According to his biography, quote, he meditated until the sun came up the next day. He remained there for several days, purifying his mind, seeing his entire life and previous lives in his thoughts. During this time, he had to overcome the threats of Mara, an evil demon, who challenged his right to become the Buddha. When Mara attempted to claim the enlightened state as his own, Siddhartha touched his hand to the ground and asked the earth to bear witness to his enlightenment, which it did, banishing Mara. And soon a picture began to form in his mind of all that occurred in the universe, and Siddhartha finally saw the answer to the questions of suffering that he had been seeking for so many years. In that moment of pure enlightenment, Siddhartha Gautama became the Buddha, which apparently means he who is awake. Okay, so he had a transcendental experience, and according to this biography, he spent the remaining 80 years traveling and preaching the Dharma, which is basically the name for the teachings of the Buddha. Wow, actually it sounds a hell of a lot like Christianity. A guy comes to adulthood, at which point he becomes aware, just like Jesus getting baptized. He battles with a demon for supremacy, and then he spends the rest of his life preaching. Of course, I haven't found anything about him being sacrificed for mankind or anything, but anyways, that's a little bit about Buddhism and its origins. They have 4 noble truths, which are as follows. 1. Unsatisfactoriness and suffering exists and are universally experienced. 2. Desire and attachment are the causes of unsatisfactoriness and suffering. 3. There is an end to unsatisfactoriness and suffering. 4. The end can be attained by journeying on the noble Eightfold Path. Oh, okay, there's a path to follow now. Well, what's on the Eightfold Path? 1. See things as they truly are without delusions or distortions, for all things change. Develop wisdom by knowing how things work, knowing oneself and others. 2. Decide to set a life on the correct path. Wholehearted resolution and dedication to overcoming the dislocation of self-centered craving through the development of loving kindness, empathy, and compassion. Jesus Christ, these are long. Okay, I'm gonna summarize the other 6. 3. Don't lie or spread rumors. 4. Don't be a dickhead. 5. Don't harm living things. 6. Find a balance between being overzealous about religion and being overly moderate. 7. Rid your mind of self-centered thoughts and emotions. And finally, 8. Meditate constantly. And then they have 5 precepts? Are you kidding me? Even the Bible doesn't have this many rules. Okay, it does. It has a lot more. I'll stop complaining. Here's a summary of the 5 precepts. Precept number 1, don't hurt living creatures. 2, don't steal. 3, refrain from sexual misconduct, whatever that is. What is sexual misconduct? Thanks for defining it for us, because times change. Was it sexual misconduct at the time to f*** goats? I don't know. It might not have been. We need some information here. 4, refrain from incorrect speech. I also don't know what that is. Is it swearing or is it bad grammar? 5, refrain from intoxicants. Well, what the f*** are intoxicants? I know they had alcohol back then, but did they have weed? Is weed included in that? What about prescription medications? I would love some detail up in this piece. So anyways, those are their core values and rules. And to answer my earlier question about sexual misconduct, I had to look to modern Buddhism because Siddhartha didn't say enough about it himself. What a jagoff. So modern Buddhists feel like sex outside of marriage is sexual misconduct. That isn't allowed. Buddhist monks and nuns are celibate, which means they don't do anything with anybody. That sucks. But for the common Buddhists, they have what's called sexual yoga, and it's required to reach Buddhahood, or true awakening. But it isn't for everybody. It's pretty regulated, and it's only allowed after years of training. As for homosexuality, some Buddhist leaders have spoken out about it, but there are some pretty diverse opinions on the subject within the upper ranks of Buddhism. So generally, they don't care a whole lot. But if they had to fall on one side or the other, I think they'd mostly be against being gay. On the other hand, Western Buddhism is usually pretty gay-friendly. Of course, they believe in reincarnation. As I said earlier, during his awakening, Buddha meditated all night and claims to have remembered his past lives. So they think that when you die, you're reborn into the body of something else. If you were a bad person, you become a dog or a bug or something. If you were good, you're born as a rich person. And on it goes until you become the ultimate good person, at which point you die and reach nirvana. You have to perfectly master the Noble Eightfold Path before you can reach it. That's why they don't believe in harming any living thing, because they believe that the soul of other people exists within them. And for reference, nirvana is the end to reincarnation. You're just done being reincarnated. It is the ultimate achievement. Moving on to their spiritual leader. Tibetan Buddhism is kind of viewed as the main branch of Buddhism in general, much like Roman Catholicism is viewed as the main branch of Catholicism. And Tibetan Buddhists have a spiritual leader called the Dalai Lama. There's always a new Dalai Lama who is quote-unquote discovered every time the old one dies. Of course, he's reincarnated, so they go in search of where his soul ended up when the old one dies. It started when their spiritual leader, Gendun Drup, who lived from 1391 to 1474, died. They didn't really believe the Dalai Lama was reincarnated into new bodies every time until way later when they supposedly discovered a 2-year-old who kept saying he was the incarnation of this guy. The monks were intrigued by the claim, so they went to the kid's house and determined that he was, in fact, the reincarnated Dalai Lama. Nowadays, the Dalai Lamas claim they can choose which body they inhabit, so there doesn't need to be much of a search. However, every now and then they still have to search for the body he inhabited. The Tibetan government, being basically completely religious rule, goes in search of the reincarnation. They usually start the search by meditating at Tibet's central holy lake, at which point they wait for a vision or indication of the direction in which they should be searching. The origins of this belief relate to the spirit of the lake being a protector of the lineage. When they follow up on the visions and a kid is found, always a boy by the way, they perform a number of tests to see if it's really him. The tests involve comparing the kid against a secret set of criteria. Then they show the kid a set of items to see if he chooses the one that belonged to the last Dalai Lama. Sometimes it's things like a mirror or a hairbrush, some other little trinket. If more than one kid is found to meet the criteria and actually chooses the right item, a public lot is drawn by officials and monks. When finally chosen, the boy and his family go to Lhasa, where he can study Buddhism and relearn all the knowledge he lost in the transition from one body to the next. Now on to extremist behavior, because there are some crazies out there. We're gonna have to talk about Tibet. In October of 1950, the Chinese People's Liberation Army invaded Tibet. Tibet is right next to China, and it's kind of the home of a major branch of Buddhism. Of course, one of the central tenets of Buddhism is you can't harm living things. So what did they do? The Buddhist monks there did what's called self-immolation protests. They'd light themselves on fire in protest of the Chinese army being in their country. It was a graphic, crazy thing to see. So when things get extreme with Buddhism, this is what you get. There are rumors of other extreme branches of Buddhism that actually perform suicide bombings and calls to violent action, but the sources I found aren't extremely reliable, so I'll just say that there are violent Buddhist cults out there. I'm not going to get into detail because the details are so unreliable, but there was talk of a mass killing of Jains, which is a popular religion in India, for disrespecting the Buddha. Supposedly around 18,000 followers of Jainism were killed. If you're looking for the ultimate pacifists, Jains are your people. They will strain water through cheesecloth before drinking it so they don't swallow a bug. They will stare at their feet as they walk so they don't step on anything. The more extremist the religion gets, the less violent it gets. Anyways, there are some other reports of violent Buddhism in Japan and Sri Lanka, but it isn't extremely common. Even without extremism, it seems like you have to buy into a lot of unfounded beliefs for this. I'm just not into it. It's nice that they're peaceful and they don't want to harm a living thing, but I can do that without being part of a religion. I don't need to buy all the other bullshit they spread to have the good that comes with it. I'll throw out the bad, keep the good. If you're looking for a religion, then you could do worse than this. But I'm not looking for a religion. I'm looking for a good way to live my life, and I'm the arbiter of my moral values, so Buddhism has no value to me. Anyways, that's all I've got for you. Follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon, and join my new Discord. Links are in the description. Thanks for watching.